Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Yolis. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Medieval Literature, and it's my privilege and pleasure to moderate today's session and to introduce our speaker. Before I do so, I should say that this session is sponsored by both the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of York and by the Center for Medieval Literature of the University of Southern Denmark and at the University of York. Professor Bora comes to us from the University of Leeds, where she is Associate Professor of Islamic History in the School of Languages, Cultures, and Societies. Her work focuses broadly on the history and historiography of early and medieval Islam, specifically Arabic historical texts of the Fatimid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk eras in the 6th through 9th Islamic centuries, corresponding to the 12th through 15th centuries of the Common Era. I know that her work, which speaks to the archival culture and practices in the medieval Near East, will be of keen interest to those here, not least among my colleagues at the Center for Medieval Literature. Her recent monograph, Writing History in the Medieval Islamic World, The Value of Chronicles as Archives from 2019, examines this topic extensively. In this book, she proposes a new paradigm for approaching 14th century Mamluk historiography, often characterized as being quote-unquote encyclopedic in nature. Through a close examination of the sources, including Ibn al-Furat's account of the late Fatimid rule, Professor Bora argues that the principle of quote-unquote archivality functioned as the epistemic key to Mamluk historical writing, one which holds deep explanatory power alongside the well-trodden ground of encyclopedism. Today, she will be speaking to us on archives and archival sensibilities in medieval Arabic historiography. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Bora.
Thank you so much, Julian. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you today. I should point out I'm not a professor, I'm a doctor, but an associate professor. I mean, you may have different designations in Denmark, but thank you for elevating me beyond my deserving. No, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm quite keen to kind of share these ideas with you because I feel that a lot of colleagues I know, medievalists, have very interesting ideas around archives and how those intersect with and correlate with historiography and memory making and memorialization of the past and documentation. So hopefully once the talk's over, we can have a discussion about whether some of these ideas resonate in the areas that you all work in or whether they don't even. So that I'm looking forward to a discussion afterwards. I'm going to share my screen for my slides to appear. So let me just try and do that. So have they appeared successfully, you all? Yeah, great, thank you. So the title of the talk is Archives and Archival Sensibilities in Medieval Arabic Historiography. I'm kind of proposing a kind of slightly different understanding of what archive means in this particular context than it might mean in many other contexts. And the talk has several dimensions to it, and I'm just going to show you a kind of a sort of contents page for the talk, just because I cover various bits of ground, so I don't want it to become too kind of shapeless. So here's sort of the shape of the talk, if you like. I begin by mentioning the context of the author I work with, al-Furat, and his particular approach to history and where he sits in the landscape of Arabic historiography. And also where he was located physically. And then I move quickly on to the particular aspect of his chronicles that I've examined in more depth. And that is his study of the Fatimids as a dynasty and their contributions to the history of Egypt and the Islamic world. However, their historiography is not seen as extant. It's considered a lost archives in many ways. I kind of question that framing, which persists in many secondary studies. I then talk about archivality and the archival term, both for us as modern researchers, but also in the kind of medieval context. What kind of what sort of archivality do I mean when I say Arabic historiography and its archival dimension? I kind of try and spell that out a bit more. And then that leads me on to archival strategies within this body of historiography. This then allows me to kind of make some comments about what we think of as the genius of various historians, some well-known and some less well-known. And in that, I will kind of try to probe the archival landscape as productive of this kind of genius. And then I kind of contrast the archival prism with concepts such as encyclopedism, but also the kind of obsession with preserving books and reading books and kind of including books within chronicles, what Elias Bohanna has called omnivorous textual consumption. And then I return back to Ibn al-Furat, his particular text, the manuscript thereof, and archival signs in this text. And then I end with some reflections on the intertextual Mamluk archive. So that's the shape of the talk. And I hope it's sort of, it comes together quite well. So I'm going to read my text out, and the reason I'm reading it out is because there's a lot to cover and I don't want to miss parts out. So here I go. So in 1256 AD, the first Mamluk Sultan Aybak, who ruled from 1250 to 1257, endowed in Old Cairo, Ufustat, a Sunni law college or madrasa named al-Mu'iziyah after his regnal title. This was an institution built using high-quality masonry acquired from the dilapidated Rowda citadel on the Nile. Some decades later, a hadith scholar and historian named Ibn al-Furat wrote a book of history while working at this law college as a teacher and as a notary witness. Now, in the later 15th century, this institution, the al-Mu'iziyah, fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. No trace of it remains today, except rare passing references in medieval Arabic topographies. The history book that Ibn al-Furat wrote while based there, however, his Universal Chronicle, a multi-volume account of Islamic world history, popularly known as Ta'rikh ad-Duwal wal-Muluk, or History of Dynasties and Kings, survives to this day in 2 autographed copies, now in libraries in Austria, Morocco, Turkey, and the Vatican. It's a chronicle that has endured and survived 6 centuries of historical vicissitudes, despite never having been copied again as a whole text. I mean, that seems almost a miracle in itself, this survival. However, it's not a miracle, as we'll go on to see. The 15th century Arabic texts inscribed on low-quality paper radically outlived Mamluk buildings constructed in expensive materials should not, however, surprise the modern observer, for this is an outcome of a medieval Arabic archival sensibility, an obsessive drive to preserve key texts, which is the topic of my talk today. Now, I'll begin by defining the term archive, the key analytical prism of the presentation. A useful and widely applicable definition is used in UK National Archives, where it's stated, quote, "An archive is one of the many collections of documents or records that have been selected for permanent preservation because of their value as evidence. Archives have value to nations and regions, organizations, communities, and individual people. They provide evidence of activities which occurred in the past. They tell stories, they document people and identity, and are valuable sources of information for research," unquote. So that's the kind of definition I work with, which I found to be, fairly useful. I move on now to the absent Fatimid archive. So for those who don't know, the Fatimids were an Ismaili Shi'i dynasty who ruled Egypt and parts of North Africa and beyond for 200 years, from 969 to 1171. They were ousted by the dynasty of the Ayyubids, who in turn were brought down by the Mamluks. And the Mamluk era is when Ibn al-Furat is writing. The Mamluks are Sunnis, and so Ibn al-Furat is a Sunni historian looking back at a Shi'i Ismaili past. And that interconfessional landscape is relevant to the talk, which we'll come back to that later on. So, the Fatimid archive of historiography. So I wanted to sort of sketch the kind of contours of historiography in the Fatimid era, and also documentary archives as well in the same period. Not every community in the pre-modern Islamicate past had archival repositories that survive intact to the present day. State or chancery archives in particular have often been singled out for having been lost to posterity. In fact, for many years, modern scholars labored under a misapprehension, since refuted, that medieval Islamic polities or communities did not produce documents in vast numbers, compared to pre-modern Latinate legal or ecclesiastical collections at least. Yet we now know that formal collections of chancery documents were routinely deacquisitioned and the paper in them put into circulation for reuse. Arabic codices of the pre-printing age, as can be found in libraries around the Islamic world and in modern Western collections, have been found to reuse paper previously used in chanceries and other institutions. In the same mode, individual scholars would often repurpose personal documents or paper repurposed from state archives to write out newer texts. And I have a couple of examples of this here. So here you have the historian al-Maqrizi, very, very well-known Egyptian historian, and he worked for a time in the state chancery, obviously was able to acquire deacquisitioned paper from documents produced by the chancery. And in this example, you see he's using some of this paper for a notebook in which he's summarizing, books on law, historiography, etc. So the smaller writing is Maqrizi's own handwriting, and the larger writing is the chancery scribe who's written out a document. And one of the characterizing features of chancery documents is that often there will be wide spaces between text, between portions of text. This is, what Marina Rusto has called the kind of conspicuous consumption of a dynasty which prided itself on its material signs of its wealth. So this kind of paper was ideal for someone like Maqrizi to reuse because there was plenty of space that he could fill with newer writing. And also the other valuable aspect of this paper is it's sultani paper, or the highest quality of paper. I can say more about paper production later in the talk, but this really is the top quality of paper you find in medieval Egypt. And so Maqrizi is able to reuse it for his note making. And then one more example I have is from Conrad Hirschler's work on the library of Ibn Abd al-Hadi in Damascus. And this scholar is a hadith scholar. He writes out hadith texts and commentaries on his own marriage contract. So the larger writing is the contract drawn up by the legal scholar or the scribe, and then the smaller writing is his own handwriting. So he's reused his own paper to write out new texts. Okay, so keeping in mind then these elements of paper reuse, or these types of paper reuse, the problem seems not to be that documents were not produced in substantial quantities, nor even that they were not preserved. Rather, what we have is an intellectual culture in which a folio, as a material object, would serve a variety of social and semantic functions that could change over time, which is a point I'll return to later. Now, one Islamic dynasty whose written records have conventionally been regarded as lost is the Ismaili Shi'i Fatimid dynasty, which ruled Egypt, North Africa, and beyond in the 10th to 12th centuries. So this is the Fatimid dynasty at its greatest height. For the most part, neither their formal documents nor their narrative texts, by which I mean books on history, biography, administration, topography, seem to be extant in themselves in ways we might expect as discrete texts or as document collections. On the other hand, the confessional literature of the Fatimids, as an Ismaili or Sevena Shi'i dynasty, is better preserved for having been transported for safekeeping to the Yemen in the 1060s, when this material would be shielded from the epistemic and political violence that ensued during the Fatimids' last decade in power. The Fatimids left behind a rich material culture. However, the history of Fatimid text is much more checkered. Modern scholarship has lamented an absent Fatimid textual archive, no better illustrated than in a legend that long circulated in the medieval period about the fourth Fatimid Caliph al-Mu'izz and his triumphant arrival in Egypt after a campaign of conquest. So this is kind of a legend that is often cited, but it gives rise to many divergent readings. So in the words of Ibn Khallikan, the medieval Arabic biographer, the great Imam and Caliph al-Mu'izz li-Din Allah was challenged by local courtiers upon his entry to Cairo in 973 to prove his ancestry. In other words, here is a Shi'i ruler coming newly into Cairo, and local Sunni notables want him to prove his pedigree. Al-Mu'iz's reply was to draw his sword as his nasab or affiliation and name, and throw down his gold coins as his hasab or ancestry. Now, one reading of the story is that this proves that the Fatimids had no history, no genealogy, no credentials, and thus no legitimacy. But Michael Brett, a modern historian, reminds us that the sword was called Dhul-Fiqar, which was the sword of Ali, the fourth caliph from early Islam, and the first of the Alids, rulers in the Shi'i tradition. And the coins were stamped with an Alid motto or legend. This is Michael Brett in his essay on lingua franca in the Mediterranean. So this story gives rise to paradoxical readings. Does it demonstrate historiographical avoidance from the Fatimids, who are often essentialized, like other Shi'i communities, as circumventing the need to maintain historiographical or archival records? Is it a sleight of hand to distract the caliph's new courtiers? Or is this a demonstration of the opposite, underscoring a long history of maintaining a material record of high Alid pedigree? So this kind of debate kind of encapsulates how the Ismaili Fatimid dynasty is often treated in secondary literature. They're kind of either regarded as not having produced a proper account of themselves for various reasons, often cultural reasons, or there's a kind of a lament that their records are missing, records were produced and they're missing. The archive of Fatimid state documents, which was as full, as complex, and as productive and reproductive of important documentation as any Islamic polity of the pre-modern world, survives piecemeal today in several ways. So the story with the documents is a little bit different. We do have various records, not in large numbers, but still, you can see evidence that the Fatimid Chancery produced masses of documents. So some of the ways in which these documents have been preserved to the present day include the following. So you have original Fatimid Chancery documents preserved in institutional or formal archives, such as the rare but extremely valuable decrees preserved at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. They've been uncovered by many scholars, including Donald Richards. Then you have Fatimid Chancery documents discovered in the Cairo Geniza, both originals and copies. These copies were made within the Chancery itself for record-keeping purposes. And this corpus is currently undergoing expansion in view of the evolving discovery within the Geniza collections of state documents once deacquisitioned by the Fatimid Chancery and repurposed for a range of writings by Jewish communities in medieval Cairo. And the vast majority of these papers with, Fatimid Chancery material on them and later writing from the Jewish communities on them at the same time. These mostly are unpublished, but various Geniza projects, in particular Marina Rusto's project at Princeton, is publishing these piecemeal, piece by piece, and it's uncovering a huge story of Fatimid administrative practice that has hitherto remained kind of hidden, and it's broadening our understanding enormously. And these two examples above demonstrate the reuse of valuable Sultani or government paper, a finer quality of paper than several others that identified from the Cairo Geniza. And then you have documents preserved in later literary or devotional sources, such as extant transcripts of letters from the Caliph al-Mustansir to his Sulayhid vassals in the Yemen, preserved by the Tayyib communities of Yemen and India. So those are still extant today. And then you also have documents embedded in literary works. So for example, you have the reminiscences, the letters and other personal notes of the 10th century Fatimid Chamberlain Jawdar, transcribed by his secretary Abu Ali Mansur al-Aziz al-Jawdari. And that's an extant text. In many of these modes of document preservation, we see a quite different or more varied life cycle for state documents and a radically different archival sensibility than the kind we may be used to seeing in pre-modern European contexts. In medieval Cairo, the textual archive is dynamic rather than a dynamic rather than a static material corpus. The ontological status and real-worldly value of Fatimid documents, for example, evolve over time as epistemological needs change and develop. Even where a formal archive would be decommissioned, and the documents released to be reused for domestic, commercial, belletristic, confessional, or other purposes. The original material could remain in circulation, as new material could be inscribed in gaps on existing texts, as we saw in the two examples I showed you earlier. This, then, is one kind of survival pattern we see fairly commonly in the medieval Islamic world, exhibiting one type of archival sensibility. Another kind of archival sensibility is visible in key works of Arabic historiography, as powerfully illustrated by the document-laden chronicle of al-Furat with which I began this talk. Before I delve into this book and its preservation of earlier, some otherwise lost sources, I'd like to take stock of the scope of Fatimid historiography briefly to better contextualize later historians' role in preserving the Fatimid archive. So the Fatimids' own production of history books was seemingly not prolific, at least not so against the anachronistic and culturally ethnocentric expectations of modern Western scholarship. One very important, albeit late 15th century book of Ismaili Fatimid history is extant, the 7-volume historical digest, Uyun al-Akhbar, written by the head of the Tayyibi Ismaili mission of the Da'i Mutlaq in the Yemen, Idris Imad ad-Din, who died in 1468. So there we have a very solid and substantial book of Fatimid historiography, albeit written centuries after the fall of the dynasty. Its final volume narrates historical episodes from lives of caliphs al-Mustansir to al-Amir, i.e. the last century of Fatimid rule. Subsequent caliphs were regarded by the Tayyibis as usurpers, so they don't feature in this book. The book offers a partisan Tayyibi reading of Fatimid history, yet it also preserves testimonies from eyewitnesses to late Fatimid history, including, for example, work by the poet Umar al-Yamani, and also documents preserved in the Yemen, royal decrees, for example, dispatched from Cairo to the Sulayhids over the reigns of al-Mustansir to al-Amir, and doctrinal works sent to the Yemen in the 1060s. So there you see the Yemeni kind of archive which preserves Fatimid material. But what about the Fatimid historiography produced between the dynasty's move to Egypt in the 10th century and the 15th century digest of Idris? So what happens in these intervening 4 or 5 centuries? And I have here a list of some of the historiographical texts that were produced, not all of them extant in complete forms, but certainly they present a fragmentary but nevertheless fairly comprehensive record of Fatimid rule. I mean, you don't have to go through, read through all of this, but it's just something it's just there for illustrative purposes. In short, more was written than is commonly assumed. A number of men within Fatimid Egypt, most of them servants of the state in some capacity, wrote eyewitness accounts of Fatimid rule, some of which were likely official or semi-official in nature. These authors' works are largely not extant, but are preserved in several later works of historiography. More than a dozen Fatimid era chronicles are thus known from later annals. It is predominantly through later references that we know of these books' existence, for example, courtly chronicles by al-Musabbihi and Ibn Zulaq, or Ibn Sayyid's account of the Fatimid Vizierate, etc., I could go on, and poetic works by Umar al-Yamani and others. So these authors' works, if not extant in themselves, are widely cited by Mamluk authors, writing 200 plus years after the dynasty's fall. Their presence, or the presence of these works in later compilations, indicates that the Arabic historiographical tradition from Fatimid to Mamluk times is marked more by continuity than disruption. So the fact that we don't have these books to hand today in many cases is not because they didn't survive the Fatimid era, because they obviously did survive into the Mamluk era. It's their subsequent loss is that we need to kind of consider, and that's really a mystery that has yet to be solved. It's a mystery that pertains really to the early modern era of manuscript drain and the kind of loss of many Islamic era sources from their original places of production and their spread across the world, whether in the Islamic world or even in the Western world. Okay, so the presence in later compilations indicates that the Arabic historiographical tradition from Fatimid to Mamluk times is marked more by continuity than disruption, despite the epistemic violence neglect of texts, looting or burning of books, destroying libraries, etc., that appears to be expected, at least in the modern mind, to accompany the forcible wresting of political power from Shi'is by Sunnis. So the idea that Sunnis did not respect the Shi'i tradition is only partially true. They did not respect the kind of the confessional literature of the Ismailis, but they did preserve the historiography within their own chronicles. I'm going to turn now to the medieval and modern archival turn to kind of account for this preservation of texts. So Fatimid history is thus preserved and commemorated largely in the interconfessional context of Mamluk Sunni authors looking back at a regionally constitutive Shi'i past, with these later works offering a range of direct or indirect views on Fatimid legitimacy. Ibn al-Furat of the Mu'izziya Law College in Old Cairo procures dozens of sources, many since lost, for Near Eastern history of the 12th to 15th centuries, 12th to 14th centuries, including 12 named prose sources for late Fatimid rule. I turn shortly to his methodology in managing this material, but at this stage it may be useful to point out that his working methods include what Koenig and Whitmarsh describe in late antique contexts as the archival process of, quote, the itemization, analysis, ordering, hierarchization, synthesis, and synopsis, unquote, of available texts. To cite them directly, they argue that archival thinking, in this view, encourages a specific approach to knowledge as manipulable, discrete fragments that are to be subjected to a process of analytical ordering. And this describes, I would say, very perfectly the way in which Ibn al-Furat marshals his sources, his Fatimid era sources, to tell the story of the Fatimids 200 years in power in Egypt. Can we then describe Mamluk historians as archivists? And if so, what extra lucidity does the concept of archive bring to our understanding of the aims and methods of medieval Arabic historiography? These questions direct us towards the archival turn in the recent study of the humanities. And I list here some of its key features of kind of as kind of presented in a range of literature on kind of archivality and archives and archivistics. So some of the key features of the modern archival turn are as follows. One is an acknowledgement of the contingent and subjective nature of all kinds of archives. And this really allows us to question the one somewhat prevailing assumption that documentary records give us a less subjective understanding of history than narrative texts such as chronicles. Number two is a need, kind of emphasizing the need for thorough scrutiny of context and power dynamics embedded within conventional documentary archives, i.e. e.g. the performance of identity, of lineage, of community, or confessional and political power dynamics and hierarchies embedded within documentary archives. And thirdly, a move away from the notion of an archive as a spatially fixed entity to an emphasis on archival practices. So the idea of an archive being a place that you visit in which you rummage around in documents, I think is seen as now, of course, that exists and that's an important type of archive, but to broaden the concept of archive is also enriching because it allows us to focus on all the practices that led to different forms of archives, including books as archives of previous material. So all of this allows us to think about archives rather than as a demonstration of history. They would be then characterized as resources to allow us to research history more deeply through its multiple layers of kind of text making and so on. So those are sort of some of the kind of features of the archival turn that have been very helpful to me in thinking about how Ibn al-Furat works and how his work demonstrates some of the deeper sort of values and practices of Mamluk historiography. So this last point about archival practices is particularly illuminating of the working methods of a historian like Ibn al-Furat. Some of the key ways in which we see Ibn al-Furat apply an archival sensibility is in the fact that he does not merely accumulate, but carefully orders his sources with explicit commentary on their value in self-reflexive mode, which alerts his readers to the fact that he's concerned with creating and arranging a reliable register of textual witnesses to the history that he's describing. There's further self-reflexivity in the way he identifies particular sources. For example, when he cites a very famous universal chronicle by Ibn al-Athir, he tells us that he receives it via an intermediary historian called Maybars al-Mansuri. And to the average reader, this is information which is more or less unnecessary. But for the learned reader, the fact that Ibn al-Furat tells us the provenance of his sources and how he receives one through another is, I think, deeply illuminating of his self-reflexivity, and also that he's spelling out his archival methodology. I mean, it's sort of on one hand a bibliographic practice, but archival in the sense that he's tracing the provenance of his source material within his sort of knowledge archive. So I'll say a bit more now about archival strategies in Mamluk historiography. So archival practices are in evidence in all manner of post-Fatimid texts that help to preserve the Fatimid archive of narrative texts, where we see signs of the accumulation, selection, retrieval, ordering, and patterning of sources in the way that Koenig and Whitmarsh have described. Ibn al-Furat is in this both a beneficiary and a creator of the historiographic archive. Arabic historiography is denoted in medieval Arabic scholarship by the term ta'rikh, the noun of the verb arrakha, to mark with a date, a hallmark of archival practice as well as historiography. Thus, the epistemological environment of formative and middle period Islamic centers of learning can be seen to be characterized by archival tendencies and sensibilities and an archival fabric, to adapt the words of one recent study, that is traceable in both social and intellectual spheres. So I'll move on now to thinking about how this archival landscape allows us to gloss the idea of genius, or kind of, the work of authors who are regarded as extraordinary in the kind of depth and innovation of their scholarship. So beyond genius to the archival landscape. So our appreciation of the archival sensibilities and working methods of medieval Arabic historians allows us to clarify, or in some cases to lay to rest, several imprecise assumptions that seem to persist in some studies of medieval Islamic book production in the field of historiography. One of these is the notion that prominent authors like Ibn Khaldun or al-Maqrizi is the one whose writing and handwriting we saw earlier, where he was reusing chancery documents. So prominent authors like Ibn Khaldun or al-Maqrizi were geniuses, in quotes, for the breadth of their thinking and the innovation of their ideas. Clearly, these were savants, scholars steeped over decades in the study of texts and context and the meanings thereof. One would not wish to detract from the scale or significance of their contributions. Yet it may well be more helpful to see these historians as the products of, and as producers in, an intellectual culture in which an archival record-keeping mindset clearly conditions and results in the production of many key chronicles. It remains critical for us to define as concretely as our sources allow the fastidious processes involved in piecing together historical knowledge and writing chronicles and other works of historiography that are ordered in the manner of what we now think of as archives, repositories of documents. In other words, the histories written by Ibn al-Furat, Ibn Khaldun, al-Maqrizi, they're all roughly contemporary with each other, and others, once we hone in on the stages of their writing processes, moves us beyond vague platitudes about genius towards elucidating more clearly the epistemic context of rich, well-resourced writing, in which a solid documentary record of history provides a canvas for innovative thinking in a larger view. Okay, so that then brings me to the question of the fact that these authors had at their disposal vast reserves of earlier works or contemporary works they could draw on to build up their own narrative texts of historiography. So this section is called The Encyclopedic Age of Bibliophilia and Omnivorous Textual Consumption. And here I'm drawing on kind of tropes and metaphors that I would say you can find quite widely in secondary literature on medieval Arabic book production. And it's the sort of very attractive set of ideas that kind of medieval Arabic authors were able to draw on a huge range of sources, but that they basically devoured them and they reproduced them and regurgitated them. This sort of feeding metaphors abound. So the point about resources brings me to a second set of ubiquitous and admittedly appealing characterizations of medieval Arabic history writing, that we are speaking about historiography in an encyclopedic age of bibliophilia, sometimes it's called bibliomania, and omnivorous textual consumption. These descriptions are based in truth, yet the concept of the encyclopedic age is helpful up to a point. After this, the archival sensibility, in my view, offers deeper explanatory power and a more precise understanding of how the historian managed and reworked it was usually a he, his textual material. Apart from anything else, selecting and preserving some materials entail the discarding of others, in the process of what Koenig and Whitmarsh have termed hierarchization. So the process of selection is something which we haven't understood very well before, but Ibn al-Furat allows us to understand it better because he comments on the value of his sources as he chooses them. The archival prism of analysis thus gives definition to the methods deployed by medieval Arabic historians, perhaps historians writing in other languages too. Hitherto, chronicles have occasionally been characterized as including an archival component, but only where they preserve documentary material per se. Ibn al-Furat's chronicle, amongst others, demonstrates the value of reading chronicles as archives in themselves, as repositories of reports, documents, poems, obituaries, and author names and titles, in which the historian's subjectivities, his biases, his pre-commitments, offer epistemological disclosures in themselves, and are thus a register of both knowledge and knowledge-making practice in the medieval Islamic world. So I move now to break down a bit more what these archival strategies in Mamluk historiography consist of. So in his account of late Fatimid rule, Ibn al-Furat employs a number of stratagems that can be identified as archival. These practices, many of which he shares with other early historians such as Abu Shama, who died in 1268, include the fact that he resourcefully collects a wide variety of historical text witnesses. He identifies the salience or relevance of both historical and epistemological information. So he tells us when he cites a report, the author's name, the book title that he's drawing from, and he also tells us what he feels about the reliability of the source he's citing. He doesn't do that in every instance. The reliability question is something that appears now and then, but author names and book titles appear extremely regularly. He copies and arranges selected extracts, showing careful management of an epistemic storage space, which is a kind of jargonistic way of saying he has to use his material carefully because he can only fit so much into a later digest. And then you have the silent obverse of selection, the discarding of source material, which I discussed above. This is another intrinsically archival practice in this methodology. So this kind of draws a little bit on Derrida's point in Archive Fever, where he talked about the fact that the archive should be understood not merely by what goes in it, but what's left out of it. That tells another story that's important to consider when we think about how knowledge is created and recreated. Further, Ibn al-Furat curates extracts in order to narrate a new account, clearly intended to preserve knowledge of late Fatimid history, which extends the life cycles of source materials and forestalls their potential descent into obscurity. I use the word curate because there is an element of crafting a selection of sources and presenting it in a particular way to present a particular kind of narrative. And in an earlier essay, I talked about the kind of the effect of this curation is to present a sort of museum of text. That's how when I read his book, that's what the kind of image that comes to mind. But the preservation of otherwise precarious sources is an important aspect of this. Text reuse is an omnipresent feature of medieval Islamicate society in both material and semantic senses. It reveals that in the sophisticated documentary culture of medieval Islamic letters, in Rusto's words, neither narrative texts nor documents simply expire. Well, sometimes, receipts, for example, would elapse and become defunct, but in general, texts remain living texts that enjoyed afterlives where their reuse was deemed practical or desirable in fresh epistemic contexts. So it's a way to reinvigorate the historiographical tradition by reintroducing texts within newer narratives and newer kind of representations of the past. Specifically, the stages of archivality discernible in Ibn al-Furat's recovery and reuse of historical reports of late Fatimid history broadly follow the pattern outlined earlier by Koenig and Whitmarsh. To reiterate, these are practices of itemization, analysis, hierarchization, sequencing, space management, synthesis, and conservation. Along this, as a corporeal object, a handwritten manuscript, Ibn al-Furat's chronicle is lucid in exhibiting the physical signs of archivality, manuscript conventions and compositional signposts that signal the intention or execution of archival methods in history writing. In this aspect, the archival mode of history writing and arrangement takes physical features common to codices of history, namely, namely the following. The use of rubrication to mark the start and ends of quote citations. That's one archival practice. And then another is the use of istikhraj or catchwords to ensure the correct order of folios. I'll show you some illustrations of these in a moment. The use of headings and subheadings to indicate the change of topic or subgenre. The addition of glosses within margins, and the alphabetization of obituary notices. So these are some of the features of Ibn al-Furat texts, which are very common across Arabic historiography and probably in historiography in other languages, at least some of them, which we would normally consider to be bibliographic practices. And they're well recognizable as such. But they also, to my mind, they indicate an intention to preserve and to order knowledge in a way I would characterize as archival. So these features disclose epistemic purposes of the author to secure structure and to clearly formulate a coherent and multi-source record of history. To expand a little on one of these methodological features, the use of rubrication in chronicles. So if I go to this one, I have here a page from Ibn al-Furat's manuscript. So I think I haven't mentioned this before, but Ibn al-Furat's text is preserved in a single autograph copy. And so everything you see on this page and throughout his book is his own work, because the book hasn't had subsequent copies made. So everything you see signals the intention of the author. There's no intervening scribe to add things or take them away. So here you see some elements of rubrication or the use of red ink. So rubrication is a practice fairly typical in codices in a range of languages in the eras before print. Ibn al-Furat separates his chapters, typically the individuals or the places or the dynasties or the events he's reporting, by rubricated bold headings. So here you see one where he's talking about a treaty between two particular rulers. And another example would be where he uses red ink to for the title "Account of the Vizier Shah's Intention," account of the Vizier Shah's invitation to the Franks, their arrival in Egypt, and their siege of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh al-Bais. So when he has a title like that, where he tells you that he's reporting an event, in this particular case, an event of great political importance, he will put the title into red ink to signal its importance, but also to kind of allow the reader to access that particular section of information in a much more visually easy way. He also uses separate sections for obituaries in his text, and again he separates narratives from obituary sections using red ink. Alongside headings, red ink is regularly used for emphasis where a change of source occurs. For example, in the phrase وَقَالَ فُلَانَ الْمُؤَرِّخ, so such and such a historian said, the waqala or said is frequently rendered in red, and that signals the beginning of a quotation. For the end of citations, intaha kalamu, or there ends his words, the word intaha is frequently in red. Other words for which rubrication is used include terms denoting accession to the caliphate, so wabuya or such and such ascended to the caliphate, and for a change of report within an annal. So, and in this year, such and such happened, so in this year will be in red. Finally, red ink is also often used to accentuate key verbs and adverbs. And basically this is a way to break up the text. The use of rubrication in manuscripts is attested from at least late antiquity and Islamic context from Umayyad times, and its value as an explicit archival practice has been noted in non-Islamic codicological contexts, for example, in relation to the 11th century tax and assets audit conducted by the Normans in Britain, known as the Domesday Book, portions of which use rubrication. In Ibn al-Furat's case, as the rubrication is in his own hand and not that of a subsequent scribe, the inferences we can draw are: one, that these were finalized versions of his chronicle intended for circulation. In other words, he had a set of readers in mind. They're not simply notes. And secondly, there is an emphasis on clear organization and retrievability of items of information in his chronicle. Okay, I also have examples of where he's left space for obituaries. So that's another page of his text where he's left space to add obituaries later as information becomes available to him. And this is an example of catchwords. So here you see at the bottom of the page, waja'a, or kind of a verb, which is reproduced at the beginning of the next page. And this is to ensure that the folios are in the correct order in an era before these pages would have been bound into quires or books. So again, I regard this as, although it's a bibliographic practice, it's also an archival practice. It's a way to preserve knowledge in the correct way. So taking all this together, oh, excuse me, if I just go back to this, yeah. So taking all these signs of archival practice together, what does this tell us about the intertextual Mamluk archive? The putative absent or erased Fatimid archive is revealed on deeper inspection to have been better preserved than is often appreciated, not least through the intertextual composition of the Mamluk archive of historical knowledge. This intertextuality is one of recourse, retrieval, and reinterpretation, in which, in Kropp and Pfeiffer's words, quote, a whole web of texts is constantly and consciously, paradigmatically and syntagmatically evoked, co-thought, quoted, reworked, and reinterpreted with every phrase and sentence, unquote. So this description of intertextuality is highly resonant in the work of Ibn al-Furat and authors like him. In utilizing and preserving key primary texts originating from the Fatimid era itself, Ibn al-Furat's chronicle, viewed alongside other historical texts favoring similar rubrics, embodies the concept of historiography as archive, a chronicle sharply focused on socio-political history, yet also on the mechanics of history writing and of knowledge creation. It is especially conducive to opening a productive pathway for the application of the archive framework to pre-modern Islamic historiography. Based in the Mu'izziya Madrasa, which was close to a lively book market as well as paper mills, Ibn al-Furat enjoyed peculiar talent for procuring and exploiting a wide variety of textual witnesses for each period he wrote about, including reports or documents not found elsewhere in the historiographic sources, and, like Ibn Khaldun in his 6th volume of history in particular, brings together not just genres, but widely differing confessional and political perspectives, including Christian ones, which would have been written in Arabic or translated into it. A telling example of this are the parallels between Ibn al-Furat's account of the death of the last Abbasid Caliph in 1258 and 3 entirely independent European sources from separate narrative traditions, as well as a Persian one, in which Company's book is unique amongst the Arabic sources. So Ibn al-Furat manages to procure information and tell stories that you don't find elsewhere, and his archival methodology allows us to understand a bit more about how he favors a kind of highly multi-sourced account of history. In this sense, Ibn al-Furat illuminates both the intertextuality and the archivality of middle period Arabic historiography, demonstrating a deep appreciation for early authorities, judging fastidiously between them, and in some cases securing their long-term preservation. Certainly some of the Fatimid texts that he quotes are not extant elsewhere, even in secondary sources. So, to conclude, the long-term dividends of looking more deeply into the archival sensibilities that shape the writing of chronicles in the medieval Islamic world include a clearer and more specialized understanding of why history was written and by what methods. It also integrates the writing of history within a wider archival culture or archival fabric that I alluded to earlier, and makes sense of the intertextuality of medieval Arabic scholarly writing as authors in various genres co-contributed to a larger archive of knowledge to be valued by present and future readers. Now, while these authors might not agree with each other, they have their own subjectivities, their own biases, their own pre-commitments, taken together, they contribute to a wider archive of both knowledge and knowledge-making practice. Historians as archivists do not typically limit themselves to incorporating historical knowledge from one type of source, but rather cast their net widely. Finally, the benefits of the archival method of history writing were felt not just by authors who built their reputations on this kind of endeavor, but also by modern scholars like ourselves, who may not always be able to step into the institutional monuments to knowledge production. The Mu'izziya Madrasa, for example, has long gone. But we are happily able to handle and read the textual monuments of medieval Islamic production, even in the present day. Thank you. I think I'll end there.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and I think we have plenty of time to address any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And so you can use the raise hand feature to ask question, or you can just alert me in the chat, or simply unmute. So any of the options here are fine. And I might kick things off if to take the privilege as moderator. And I wanted to ask you if you could expand a bit more on the interconfessionality that you mentioned, and you also addressed it a bit towards the end, which I find really fascinating to think about. Also, as someone who works on the on Latin literature that's composed in the Levant a little bit earlier, but it certainly is engaging, seems to be engaging with a variety of religious traditions. And one of the sources that I worked on is a continuation of a 10th century Christian chronicle written by a Christian, probably in Antioch, and Al-Antaki, and he his work is a very important source on 11th century Fatimid history. And I seem to recall that it was used later on by some Ayyubid historians.
Yeah.
But I would love to know more if you see kind of also use of sources and documents of Jewish or Christian authors and how these are dealt with.
It's a really good question. I haven't noticed that there's a lot of confessional axe grinding in some of the authors I've read. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but certainly someone like Ibn al-Furat, he does have a confessional perspective. Of course he does. When he describes the Crusaders, he's pretty insulting, and he characterizes them as stupid and incompetent, including their leaders. But when it comes to the sources of history, a different thing seems to happen, which is that he seems to use authors from a wide variety of perspectives. Al-Antaki is a good example of an author who would not have been regarded as righteous for confessional reasons, but whose contribution to knowledge production is still valued in later Arabic tradition. So I would say that one of the surprising things for me, it's not a new surprise, it's something I've been aware of for many years, but one of the things that's quite revealing about some of the kind of interconfessional dynamics is that even where authors consider the Fatimids to be a heretical sect, and they would have regarded them as that, I mean, some later historians, for example, Ibn Khaldun and Maqrizi, were more sympathetic in their representation of the Fatimids, and Ibn al-Furat is also one of them. But if you were to ask them a direct question, what do you think of their legitimacy, they would have said, no, we denounce them as righteous Islamic rulers. Nevertheless, they're in terms of representing them as a dynasty and as kind of people who put Egypt on the world map in many ways, they get, I would say, a fairly rounded representation, using Fatimid's own sources and using, Imami Shi'i sources and other sources. So the confessional perspective becomes something quite different when you look at it in epistemological terms than if you look at it in political and religious terms. And that kind of, I would say, broad sourcing is not specific to one author or another. It's fairly prevalent across the works that I've looked at, in a range of genres as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I find it really refreshing to look more at from this epistemological perspective, as you say, and do a comparative analysis that way. I think is really productive. Any other questions?
I can see some hands up, by the way. I don't know if you can see them, Julian. I can see
Henry.
Oh,
I don't. Oh, they don't. Oh, I see physical hands, perhaps.
Yeah, the emoji, the hand emoji. I can see
I don't
Harry
see any.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't see any hand emojis for some reason.
If I see them, shall I call on people to just speak up? Is that okay?
Yes.
Sure.
Go for it.
Go for it, Henry. You've been waving your hands.
Sorry.
I think you're
muted.
Muted. It could be the headphones that sometimes messes it up for me.
No, it's not that. I'll
There you go.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can, yes.
No, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Sorry about my rubbish communication. That was really wonderful. I've learned so much. I guess I finished a project a couple of years ago about something very similar in 12th century England. So how history writers use documents in their histories, basically. And I was just wondering, and there's all kinds of questions I have, but I was just wondering whether you might be able to just reflect a bit on, I guess, the role of narrative in the making of memory, because potentially I guess there's all kinds of ways that as a writer in a manuscript culture, one can try to put texts together to give them some more weight, to make them more lasting by I guess weight of numbers. But what I mean, what in the Islamic tradition or in the text that you work on, what are the advantages of using a specifically narrative form, do you think, for assembling these documents?
I think it's a well-established genre. The Universal Chronicle is one version of narrativization of historiography, and there are others. Biographical dictionaries were another. But I think that the advantage of the narrative chronicles is that they have a readability, and it does. I mean, your question, I think, has many dimensions in a sense, because it kind of begs other questions, which is, why include documents if you're telling a story? Or if you have documents, why tell a story when you've got the documents? And I think that in the case of Ibn al-Furat, and presumably others like him, they want to preserve the past, capture it in some way, in ways that will feel substantial, because these are men with scholarly training in hadith and other sciences. So they've got that kind of background, but they want to make everything look reliable. And the reliability is an important feature of their training as intellectuals. So they'll say this has a good pedigree, this doesn't. And they're not, every author's not the same as every author, but there is that going on with some authors. So they want to tell the story of the past in a substantial way, in a reliable way, but at the same time, they use often a register of language that is accessible, the kind of so-called Cairo narrative style, which has colloquialisms in it. So that suggests that they're not simply writing for other scholars, they're writing primarily for other scholars, but also for text to be read out in popular ways, in public places perhaps. I mean, in that I would refer you to the work by Konrad Hirschler and others, where they talk about textualization and the popularization of reading and reading practices. But from what I can tell, the inclusion of documents, poems, obituaries within a narrative text is to round it out, is to provide evidence, and it's a way to preserve sources which might otherwise become lost. Other authors are much less fastidious than Ibn al-Furat and will spin a yarn and include fanciful elements. So there are a variety of practices where you do see a strong strand of archival thinking as well, which is where I've enjoyed kind of bringing out Ibn al-Furat's kind of tendencies in that regard. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. That's wonderful, and I guess that's maybe one of the difference, or one of the things that really strikes me about the Latin chronicles that I read is just how boring they are, and that some of those are clearly not actually necessarily meant to be read out in that. I mean, some of them are, but some of them clearly just like that just wouldn't work. So
yeah. I mean, I also feel that there's an element of entertainment, there's an element of educating. I think the educating element is quite strong. You know, Ibn al-Furat is a preacher. He's a notary witness as well, but his main job is, I would say, the prestigious aspect of his work is as a preacher in this madrasa. So the element of teaching and pedagogy, I feel, is a very strong element in the book. You feel it coming through. But what's lovely about the book is that he tells you about how he's hierarchizing his sources and prioritizing some over others. So he gives us extra clues which you don't get with every other author of his era.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. I see a question from Lars. Is that right?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for a really inspirational talk.
Very much.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the confessional divide you were talking about, and how that affects the transmission of text and so on, and it really reminded me of the Protestant Reformation in the Nordic countries, where basically all liturgical stuff was discontinued and destroyed, but in that process actually also a lot of historiography, because it belonged to the wrong faith. But my question. Yeah.
Can I just go switch off the phone? Sorry, excuse me a second. Do forgive me.
No worries. No, but my question is about the primary audience of this chronicle, and I guess other chronicles, and the expectations that the author could have about the accessibility for other people of these documents that they were. So I guess that plays into it a little bit, because one thing is that you want to preserve something for the future, but if some documents are obviously available for his audience, they don't need to. I mean, this is a wonderful example in the Roman historian Tacitus, when he narrates the forced suicide of the philosopher Seneca, and he says that he had this before dying, he had this long public pronouncement, but we all know that, so I'm not going to quote it. So that's, obviously his intended audience had access to that. And so I guess that plays into it also, doesn't it?
It does, but I think there's a different thing happening in the Mamluk era in which Ibn al-Furat is writing, which is that documents they're everywhere, but you in the sense that historians can cite them, and a number do. At the same time, the idea that there would be particular documents that everybody knew about was, I don't see that happening as much. I would say that where a historian had a document, it was unlikely that another historian would have the same document, because of the sort of serendipitous nature of kind of text reuse, and where chancery documents were released for, were sold on for reuse, there was a certain element of chance in the preservation. And I haven't seen, I mean, bear in mind, I'm not someone who works on the Mamluks kind of documenting of their own era. I look really at how the Mamluks look at the past. But where you see Maqrizi, for example, writing about the Mamluks, his own era, and Ibn al-Furat doing so, I don't think they use the same documents. I think they're using different documents because of the sort of serendipitous nature of the preservation. And where, for example, you have an administrative manual, so you have Al-Qalqashandi has this extremely vast compendium of epistolary practice, but also he preserved many documents. Again, he doesn't preserve the same ones as Ibn al-Furat. So it's harder to see the idea that there are documents in the public domain that people know about and then don't need to be reproduced because they're already a referent. I don't see that happening so much, but it's an interesting analog because it does, I think, reveal that, that document preservation has a different kind of profile in the medieval Islamic world than it had perhaps in the example you've cited from the antique period. Yeah, very interesting.
Divna, and then Elizabeth.
Thank you. I have a question about the part when you showed us the different signs of sort of archiving and curating in a manuscript. Mm-hmm. I guess this may sound skeptical at this point, but actually this is what I was very much interested in. And then I thought, to what extent we can consider all the material science in the manuscript, science of archival practice and curating, and what's the added value of that gesture. So my question is, do you interpret them as such in the context of historiography only, or do you think things like catchwords and rubrications are also signs of archival practice in other types of books, right? Not just in historiographical copies.
To my mind, there would be archival signs in any genre of writing because it signals a kind of, I'm thinking about the epistemological features of well, kind of the epistemological context of reading these features in particular ways. So I focused on narrative historiography, but really one could look at other texts in the Islamicate world, whether it's epistolary manuals or administrative manuals or biographical dictionaries, and they also lend themselves to archival readings. And in fact, that door is opening more and more now, where you see these works being regarded as knowledge archives, and more than simply an author just putting in whatever they can find. That's the idea of curation, careful preservation to tell a story of sorts according to the kind of needs and aspirations of the historian. That approach is becoming more and more common, and certainly that's what I've tried to do with Ibn al-Furat. So I think that any texts that have those features could be read as archival. I understand your skepticism in a sense, because what you're asking the question, what does the archival reading of them bring to the table? Why call them archival practices? I would say that to me they allowed me to understand the mind of the historian better. I could see this was not a historian who randomly includes extracts from the past texts. There's something going on here. He's choosing particularly valuable snippets. He's juxtaposing them one with another. He's when there's a controversy, he will bring in 2 or 3 versions and comment on their veracity or likely veracity, given that he's looking back on a 200-year distance, and so on. So to me, the archival prism of understanding has lent itself to that analysis I'm trying to make of what this author intends to do. I know, examining the author's intention is almost a kind of outmoded way of looking at text, but I did feel it's been missing. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's amazing work being done on Arabic historiography all the time. I learn from it daily, but to me there was something missing, which is what is the precise nature of this praxis, and the archival notion has been immensely valuable in helping me to understand Ibn al-Furat, but also others, Maqrizi and others. So yeah, it's something which I think has added value. It may not be elucidatory for every genre, but I would read those signs as archival in some sense across genres myself.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question.
Before we get to Elizabeth's question, I want to know, there was a question in the chat about something about the first image in the PowerPoint, I believe, for the manuscript, whether it was digitized. And I also, please correct me if I'm wrong, and also want to ask actually if that, if Ibn al-Furat's autograph manuscript is digitized.
In terms of the PowerPoint images, the first image is from Frederick Bowden, has done some amazing work on al-Maqrizi. And so I reproduced that image from one of his articles. If our colleague writing in the chat would like to email me, I'm happy to share the bibliographic details of the essay with them. If I have chance, I'll do it in the chat. I'll leave a message in the chat, but I'm not very good at multitasking when it comes to Zoom, I'm afraid. So feel free to email me. And then the second image was from Konrad Hirschler's work on Ibn Abdul Hadi and his library. Again, I'm very happy to post a link to that if our colleague would like me to do so. And Julian, your question was, sorry, remind me.
Ibn al-Furat's manuscript.
Yeah. Okay, so but your question, was it related to what the previous question was?
Oh, I just sort of added that on because it made me think of that. But then we have a question from Elizabeth.
Okay.
So go ahead and ask your question about Ibn al-Furat, and I'll come back.
Oh, I was just asking if his autograph manuscript was digitized.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I knew you'd asked a question. Yeah, you had asked a question, and for a moment I lost track of it. Ibn al-Furat's manuscript much of it has been digitized so a lot of it is in the Vienna National Library, but there are also volumes. There's a volume in the Vatican and some volumes in Morocco and Turkey. Now, the autograph series that I worked from is mostly in Vienna, and unfortunately, the first 3 volumes, which is what I worked on for the Fatimids, is in very poor curatorial state. So they haven't been able to digitize it, unfortunately. So I work from microfilms. Now, so microfilms were made. It has been photographed, but not digitized. So you can get printouts of the microfilm. Obviously, the digital, the digitization would be much more valuable because then you get that granularity of image. Later volumes have been digitized and they're freely available from the Vienna Library website, which is great. So you can see some of these archival signs for yourselves if you want to.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks. I think that was so rich, and I confess I haven't got a question, and I'm trying to, but I have 4 or 5 things I would love to spend time talking about instead, and I'm having trouble even choosing which one, and I will get to the one I want last. But I just, I thought there was so, as someone who works on history writing, I don't know, from the early Middle Ages to the beginning of the High Middle Ages in the West, there were so many interesting points of contact but also divergence that would be wonderful to explore around universal chronicles and autographed manuscripts, and the whole question of the reception of late antique book culture in history writing across Latin texts, Greek texts, and Arabic texts. I just thought, gosh, that would be exciting, and to watch that happening both early on, in a period we might even think of, well, depending on how you periodize, that you might even still call late antique, and then as things get later, and then revivals. Those seemed really exciting questions. But I guess I wanted to finish, and maybe that's the more exciting question we come back to, but I wanted to finish just by saying how I thought that epistemological perspective was really, really interesting. And you were also framing what you were doing across a kind of confessional divide, but there was also that fed into a dynastic divide. But it also, I found it really interesting for thinking about early 12th century history writers in England and Normandy who are trying to write across or trying to regroup or retell history in the wake of the Norman conquest. And the kind of epistemological work that's done in the wake of dynastic change. I wanted to, like, so slowly I come back to you. So I kind of throw that one back at you. I took that away from what you were saying, and I could think much more sharply around that question, and then to throw it back at you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's I love that kind of the journey of your question, so to speak.
The muddle.
Your question kind of brings to mind that I should share with you, for those of you who are not very familiar with the Arabic historiographical tradition, that in earlier centuries it was much more polemical, in the sense that, I mean, I use the word polemical. I find the word polemical, like many words we use for the medieval past, to be loaded and denigratory in ways I don't appreciate, frankly. But anyway, tendentious, let's say, serving various purposes other than purely knowledge-making purposes or knowledge-sharing purposes. There is a lot of that going on, and there is still that going on in Mamluk Cairo. So I don't want to romanticize these authors as being free of biases and political axes to grind and so forth, but rather what I have found is that those things subsist in their work and persist in their work, but the intellectual value of sources seems to trump their agenda of supporting a particular ruler. And this is a particular feature of the Mamluk historians, is that when they come to their own times, they become extremely critical of power. And you'd think, well, how on earth did they get away with writing publicly against the ruler? Won't the ruler send a few men to kind of bump them off? But obviously they have some intellectual freedom. And Maqrizi, who's come up a lot, he's really critical of the Mamluks whom he served in their chancery bureau. And he saw firsthand the intrigues of power that brought instability to his environment, to his city, to his country, to the Islamic world in many ways. And so he did not mince his words. Ibn al-Furat is the same when he writes about his contemporary times. The kind of intellectual drive to throw a critical light on his present kind of the elite of the day trumps any concern for personal safety or prestige or kind of career enhancement. So that's, I mean, that's sort of related to your question, I think, in some way. And I think what I found really valuable is that when the Mamluk authors look back at the Fatimid past, we know it's a very deep, kind of deeply entrenched confessional difference. At the same time, when Ibn al-Furat writes about the Fatimid dynasty, he calls them caliphs, he calls them imams, he gives them their designation as legitimate rulers, even though he would not have regarded them as such himself. And I think that's a very interesting perspective, which I was not particularly expecting when I first began looking into this genre of writing. So I think it's a complex picture. There are layers of agenda, political, confessional, but epistemological as well. And that last one is what's really interested me, and I found it to be incredibly revealing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope there are other occasions to talk about these things. Really.
Yeah, sure.
But the sharpness of your analytical framework was really helpful.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Maybe everyone's had enough. I don't blame you. So an hour and a half is a long time. But anyway.
Well, I think this may be a good time to stop there, and we've learned a lot. And please join me in thanking our speaker, and it's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to see you all, to share ideas with you, and also to get your wonderful questions, which, always with these questions and feedback, you sharpen your own thinking and refine your own thinking, and I find that incredibly valuable. I love the exchange aspect of it. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.